Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we're honored to be joined by Tweed Roosevelt, great-grandson of the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. A businessman, college professor, and chairman of the Theodore Roosevelt Institute at Long Island University, Tweed is also a devoted family historian. He'll share personal reflections on growing up as a Roosevelt and will bring to life fascinating stories about the many colorful and influential personalities that make up one of America's most iconic families. I'd now like to welcome Tweed Roosevelt to our show. Welcome, Tweed.
Oh, thank you very much, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
It's really fun having you on the show. I've been looking forward to speaking to you for a long time. Not only are you the great-grandson of our 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, but I've spoken with you before, and I've watched some of the other interviews you've done, and you are an amazing storyteller.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And that's what this whole podcast is about. So, I see that you are the chairman of the Roosevelt School at Long Island University.
Correct.
Yep. Can you tell me what's that about?
Well, we started some years ago, I think 4 or 5 now. Long Island University is, as you might imagine, on Long Island, New York, and close to Sagamore Hill and basically in Roosevelt country. Some years ago, I was looking around for a university to develop some kind of a relationship, an institute or something like that. And I looked at various of TR's universities like Harvard and Columbia. And, I could have gotten an institute there. I would have been one of 117, and they would have given me a closet somewhere. I looked at some of the Long Island options, but the one that jumped out at me was Long Island University. And the primary reason it jumped out at me, aside from the fact that it's near Sagamore Hill, it's a small private institution, college, that had fairly recently acquired a new president. She's spectacular. And she's what I thought would be terrific. Unlike any university president I've ever worked for or been involved with, she's very entrepreneurial, very different. And she sort of decided that she would spend the latter part of her career finding a small private institution, a university, and turning it into a first-rate school. And that's what she's been doing. And one of the things she did was offer me the option of developing this Roosevelt School of International Affairs and Public Policy with all the institute and various other things. And so I jumped at the chance because I want to be part of something that's growing and big. And she's been nothing short than spectacular. But as far as this relates to, we've started a bunch of sort of ancillary things. And one of them was the Society of Presidential Descendants, which is administrative home is the school. We have done a lot with that. So that's a sort of a brief overview.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. I've actually interviewed quite a few presidential descendants, and it is so much fun to hear not only the stories about the presidents themselves that they're descended from, but also how those presidents impacted the families that they were part of, which is one of the things I'd really like to talk with you about, because there's a lot of material out there on Teddy Roosevelt. Over the years, I've read many books about him, and I've watched a lot of documentaries. As a matter of fact, I remember being a kid, I was about 10 years old, and I was watching it was an old show. It was called Biography with Mike Wallace, I think.
Yeah.
You remember that?
I didn't realize that Mike Wallace was the guy, but I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was him. But I remember watching a documentary about Teddy Roosevelt then and being fascinated with him.
Mhm.
And there's so much, but I always wondered about his family, the children, those who were raised by Teddy and his wife, Edith. And I thought I'd talk to you today about what you know about The Children of Teddy.
There's an awful lot of books written about TR. I once wrote an article for the Theodore Roosevelt Association Journal called The 50 Essential Books on TR. And what I did was pick 50 different areas. They weren't all necessarily good books. They, in fact, might be not very good books at all, but they're the only one on the subject. And in the introduction to that, I talked about 5 books I would suggest to sort of a novice who's not a historian or anything, who's just interested in knowing about them. And one of them is called it's by a guy named Hagedorn, called The Roosevelts of Sagamore Hill, which is right on the subject you're talking about. It's an excellent book, and you get a very more or less in-depth view of the family. A lot of people, that's very interesting, and apparently to you too, so that's great. The whole family is quite interesting. I'm a professor, among other things, so I do things in hour gigs. I once did a talk, which is online actually, it's called something like The Extraordinary Cousins of Theodore Roosevelt, or relatives or something. And Saints and Sinners, I called it, because there are both in the family. And I like to kind of demystify this. We're a family like any other family. People seem to think that presidential descendants, all they do is talk about their ancestor. Well, that's not true at all. Certainly not in my family, and I suspect most of presidentials. We're a family just like any other. We talk about the sorts of things that other families talk about. Is Aunt Mabel ever going to get married? Is cousin George going to come out of this terrible time he's having at college? Whatever. And so I don't recall hearing much about TR. Although I did know my great-grandmother, we called her grandmother, TR's widow, because she lived up until I was about 7 or 8. And I spent quite a bit of time at Sagamore Hill, their home on Long Island, as a kid. But sort of the children of, well, you get down to the great-grandchildren, and it gets sort of disappears pretty much, except in the Roosevelts and maybe some others, because all Roosevelts are Roosevelts. And we're all descendant of the same character way back in 1640s. And we're all related, and there aren't any other Roosevelts. So people right away, I would play a little game in my mind of when is this person going to ask if I'm related to TR? And, it's sort of fun. Sometimes they ask immediately, sometimes they edge in backwards, sort of whatever. So it's a little amusing thing I keep in my mind. But for the children, it was a big burden. Being the children of a very famous person is a problem. And various presidents have dealt with it in different ways. And other prominent families. It's not just presidents. Think of some of the Rockefellers, for example, and how the kids handled it. So TR's, he had 2 sets of children. Alice, by his first wife, who died in childbirth. There's a whole story about that. And then the second batch. So when he remarried and starting having children, Alice had sort of the issue of being the different one. She was the stepsister. And although her stepmother, my great-grandmother, welcomed her into the family and raised her as her own, she was kind of a different sort of person. And she came from a prominent family in Boston, in New England, a Brahmin family. And she had her own wealth. And she lived an extraordinary life. There are a great many stories about Princess Alice, as she was known. So when TR became president, she was a teenager in the White House. Now, any of the listeners to this podcast who have teenage daughters will know that they can often be difficult, and Alice certainly fit that bill. Somebody once said to TR when he was in the White House, he said, why can't you manage her? She would do things, which at the time were considered, avant-garde or whatever, now would be very tame. But for example, smoking on the streets. Young women of, certain stance didn't smoke even older women didn't smoke on the streets. So Alice rather glorified on breaking the rules and being a bit of a wild person, and by today's standards, pretty modest. But anyway, somebody said to TR, why don't you handle Alice? And he said, well, he said, I can either run the country or I can handle Alice, but I can't possibly do both. It gives you an idea about Alice. She
Yeah.
had a long career. She's the one who survived the longest. She became something of a grand dame, and oh, it's a little bit shocking and a little bit, she certainly spoke her mind, very smart. Uh, she ran kind of a salon in her house in Washington on Massachusetts Avenue, where everybody of note came. I can't remember, she knew 12 presidents or whatever it was, and they would all come, and everybody in Washington knew she was kind of the grand dame. So she had a wicked tongue and she enjoyed poking various people here and there. She famously had a little pillow beside her on the couch where she held court that said, if you've got something bad to say about somebody, come here and sit next to me, or something like that. And she loved to collect all the latest news. What she called Calvin Coolidge, I think it was, for just give an example, she called Calvin Coolidge, said he looks like the figure on a wedding cake. And went on. I mean, you could go on of endless witty quips she made, but she was loved and sometimes somewhat feared. She married a man who became an Ohio congressman, Longworth, who became the Speaker of the House. It was a rocky marriage. It didn't go well. There were all kinds of problems and everything. She had one daughter. Tragically, both her daughter and her daughter's husband died shortly after they produced their first child, Joanna. And astonishingly, to me anyway, she basically adopted her granddaughter. Granddaughter lived with her. She raised her. She did an excellent job, which you wouldn't have thought from, some of the talk about her. But it's just an example. You don't always believe what you hear about people. She turned out to be a good mother, and she did a good job. Joanna's my age, and we know each other, of course, very well. She's done just fine.
She's just a, I wanted to ask you, Tweed. So we know she was a firecracker. She was also like a trendsetter. Wasn't there a color called Alice Blue or something like that?
He in the White House famously, I'm not quite sure, I haven't read all the books on her, but she really loved this color blue, which was kind of a light blue, and it apparently fitted her very well. So it became designated Alice Blue. I don't know by whom or why, but she, of course, was the focus of an enormous, as were all the kids, enormous amount of press reporting of various kinds. And when you had I don't know what, 16-year-old in the White House and then a whole bunch of younger kids, they were plenty of news there, and they were good, rambunctious family. TR was a superb father, which is really surprising for his generation. Most of his generation of the aristocratics or whatever, the upper classes of society, uh, ignored their children a lot. Children tended to be raised by the wealthy, by nannies and the like. But he really very much focused on his children and spent a lot of time with them. And it was known, for example, in the White House, 4 o'clock was kids' time. And sometimes one of his children would come in and say, Daddy, it's 4 o'clock, come. And he would stop whatever he was doing and go, and he romped with them. His wife, Edith, once commented that, she really had six children, um, because he was such a, he would play with them very successfully. They would rough and tumble and, do all this sort of kind of stuff and outdoors kind of stuff. So his children really loved him and had a great deal of time with him. They were lucky, even though he was, of course, very busy during their lives. But he was also a demanding father. He wasn't totally indulgent. He was, of course, the guy who was supposed to deliver the bad news when time came for somebody to be punished. But they had a great relationship, and the children sort of learned not only that he was a great fun, but also his whole moral view of the world, and how he thought people ought to live their lives, the strenuous life, and moral life, so on. And they benefited from that. And I think it helped them when they had to deal with the fact that they were the children of the most famous man in the world, so-called. And, everybody was looking at him all the time. It wasn't easy. And the kinds of sort of standards that TR set for them were very high. And actually, with his oldest son, Uncle Ted, Theodore Jr., when he was, oh, I don't know, at Groton, I think, that age, TR had been pushing him and didn't realize how much he'd pushed him. And Uncle Ted had some real problems with that, I don't know, psychological problems, but they were developmental problems. And TR's doctor, in those days, doctors kind of played that role, had to come to TR and say, look, you can't keep pushing this boy. You've got to you got to let up a bit because he's only 14 or whatever he was at the time. And TR did, to his credit, did. But still, the influence all through their lives of this larger than life person conveying various responsibilities and moralities and other things, not easy. And the public view of him.
Yeah. Now I'm thinking, as far as Alice having a different mother than the other children, her mother passed away when she was first born.
Tragically, TR was very young, of course. He was in his 20s, young 20s, and Alice, his wife, who he had met in college and fallen in love with almost immediately, and after tremendous pursuit, managed to wear her down, so she finally married him. And it was a real love match. He was in the state legislature in New York at the time, which met in Albany. The family lived in New York City, but he lived in Albany. And he got word that he knew his wife, of course, was pregnant, and his mother and his sister and others. It was typical in the time. You gave birth at in the house. You didn't go to the hospital. And his mother came to stay to oversee all this. And he got a telegram telling him that everything was fine. He was the father of a new baby girl, and the legislature was in session. And although he was a very controversial figure there, he was also very popular, even amongst his enemies, political enemies. And so, cigars were handed out and so on. And shortly thereafter, he got a more ominous telegram telling him to come home, that things were looking not so good. So he got in a train from Albany, several hours, bad weather. When he arrived at the brownstone in New York, it was in the middle of the night, met his brother on the stoop, who told him something to the effect that, there's a tragedy in this house. Our mother is dying, and so is your wife. And later that day, which happened to be Valentine's Day, which is what, the 14th, right? Happened to be Valentine's Day. First his mother died, and then later his wife died. And this obviously was an extraordinary blow. It was also a very public blow. All of New York, his father was a very prominent New Yorker, his family very, very well known for their eleemosynary, for their charitable activities. And a double funeral was held. New York basically went in mourning. The legislature recessed. I mean, it was a big deal. TR, as you might imagine, I mean, he was absolutely devastated. Family feared for him for a while. They figured out what he'd do. He sort of went back into work for a brief period, finished his work and the thing, and that's when he went out west. That's a whole other story. Changed his life in all kinds of ways. And his view, he had a very, he didn't believe in second marriages. And one of the reasons he opined somewhere, he said, what happens if you marry two women and, everybody after life wind up in heaven together? What are you going to do? It would seem to me an odd sort of way, but that was sort of one of his comments. I guess they hadn't heard of alternative universes or anything. But anyway, he vowed he'd never marry again. Well, that didn't last.
Yeah. He had met Edith, his second wife, when he was a
Yeah.
youngster, right?
Yeah, they grew up together. Edith was a very close family friend to one of his sisters. And there's a long story about that, but they grew up as playmates. She was there all the time. She's a couple of years younger. It made a difference depending what age you were at. But when they got to be sort of older teenagers, they became something of an item, and people thought that they were going to marry. But true love, never goes quite as it is. And there was a mysterious breakup. We don't know what actually happened. It happened in an outing that he had with her in a rowboat and a thing. And his only comment, I think, at some point was something to the effect, well, we both had a temper. So we don't know what happened. But anyway, that ended that. But she hung in there and, later on came back, swooped back. The story of that is sort of fun. She was she was still a very good friend with his sister, Connie. And TR, when he was out west, people think he lived out west for 2 years at his old ranch and all that stuff. But in fact, he went back and forth from New York quite frequently. And he had told his sister, trying to be true to his oath that he would never marry, and they said he didn't want to see Edith. Well, sisters don't always do what their brothers tell them to do.
Oh,
So he came home one day, and he'd stay with his sister when she came back to New York. He came back to this brownstone with big steps, staircase. And funny thing, nobody's in the house. And funny thing, there's Edith coming down the steps, no doubt dressed up. To me, it was clearly a setup. So it was all over them. And he felt guilty about it. They hid their engagement and they snuck off to London to get married there instead of here. But so be it. I think it wasn't outrageous. It was like 2 years after the death of his first wife. So there was nothing sort of socially wrong with that. But anyway,
Edith ended up adopting Alice into the family
yeah.
then.
Well, what happened is right after the birth, Alice, he gave Alice to his sister, Bamie, another sister. And Bamie raised her for the 3 years or whatever it amounted to be. And TR was quite willing to let Bamie keep her, but Edith said, no, of course not. Put an end to that immediately, brought her into the family. And the relationship, had some bumps, as you might have any relationship has, particularly with strong-minded people. Edith, who was, sort of to the outside world, she was very sort of placid, somewhat shy, or at least, didn't seek any kind of press or so on. As a believer, the only time you're supposed to appear in the newspapers when you're born, when you're married, when you die. So anyway, the adoption, if you will, it wasn't an adoption, obviously, but it went as well as one might expect. I mean, they got along pretty well. But Alice had the other family, the grandparents, who lived in Boston and were with whom she's close too.
That helped.
Yeah, it helped.
So you actually met your great grandmother, Edith. I know we had spoken before. You had some slight memory of her. Can you recall what that was?
Yeah, I mean, when she died, well, after TR died, she just stayed in Sagamore Hill. That was the home. It had always been the home and was the home. And so when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, who was her son, Archie. And he had a house in the next door town called Cold Spring Harbor. And we would frequently go over to and I spent a lot of time with him because my father was in the Foreign Service. And so I would, he partially brought me up. And so we would go over to Sagamore Hill frequently. I even stayed there sometimes, and to me, Edith was a distant and somewhat terrifying figure. She was of the generation that children are seen and not heard. And, I was relegated. So often we'd go over there, often in the evening, sometimes spend the night. And when we went over in the evening, the adults would have cocktails in what's called the North Room, the major room there, and then have dinner. And I was rarely, if ever, I mean, occasionally at dinner, but usually I would have dinner in the kitchen with the cook and the maids, and then I'd be sent to bed, which I resented. I'm 6 year old. I resented badly. I would be, and the bedroom was grandfather's as a kid's bed. It's a small little room on the second story of the house. And in the summer, I would be irritated. Here the sun was still up. I'm not going to bed. And I discovered that outside of the window was a little outhouse kind of thing, not a bathroom, but just a little attached to the building. And so you could climb onto that roof and then down to the garden and go play in the garden, and nobody was the wiser. And eventually you could get in, go back to bed and go to sleep when it was dark. So I used to do that occasionally. Thought I was clever. Years later, I mentioned this to my grandfather. He said, "Oh yeah, he used to do that when he was a kid." So anyway, when the kids think they're getting away with something, whether my parents knew or not, I don't know. But anyway, so I never remember her in any kind of equality, but I do remember her as vague.
Yeah, that's interesting that you have those experiences at Sagamore Hill. How cool. You were family staying in the family house, and now it's a museum, a fantastic museum, by the way. I loved going there.
Great to go there. It's yeah, but just like everybody else, I stayed at grandma's house. I mean, who didn't do that? So to me, it was not special. To me, it was just grandma's house. And the presidential aspect of it, I had no idea about this until well into my teen years. And it never particularly occurred to me that anything at all about it. If so, you had famous relative. Everybody has many people have famous relatives. And nobody talked particularly about it. So it wasn't until I became a teenager. And also the schools I went to, the environment. First of all, I spent a lot of time overseas, but the schools I went to, there were a lot of people who had ancestors, had names that were well known. I mean, I remember Fonda, for example. I went to school with Peter Fonda, and there were, Rockefellers, people, just so it didn't seem any particularly different. I mean, I've been raised, somebody who raised in a small town in Iowa who rarely meets anybody who's a household name. This was a different kind of upbringing, and it was New York City, of course.
Mhm. Well, that's interesting that you have that history. Now, maybe we could move on to, you mentioned him before, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. I know, I remember reading a quote from General Omar Bradley, who said he was asked, I guess, what was the most heroic thing that he saw a soldier do. And he said it was TR Jr. on Utah Beach on D-Day. What do you know about your great uncle, Teddy Jr.?
This won't surprise you, but everything has a story.
Good, go for it.
uh, the boys of TR were raised to go to war most it happened, and so they all did. And Kermit, Quentin, TR Jr., and my grandfather Archie were all in the First World War. And the three older ones were in Big Red One, the First Division. And in those days, you could send families together. They've since, because of that famous ship where 5 boys were killed, I remember one family split them up. But and they were in Big Red One, and their youngest brother Quentin was one to fly, so he became a pilot. And pilots didn't live very long in those days, and so he was killed almost immediately. Great tragedy, of course. And the three surviving brothers served with much distinction in the First World War. Uncle Ted, the oldest, was the highest level. He was a major or something in the First World War. My grandfather was a lieutenant, and Kermit, forget what he was. Anyway, so they had served well. Grandfather was severely injured in one arm and one leg, almost died. They thought he was going to die, so the French gave him the Croix de Guerre, but then he didn't die. He was a tough old bird, and he came back. And so, all right, that's the First World War. When the Second World War came around, none of them were career Army, so they all had business careers in between. Theodore Roosevelt, Uncle Ted, joined up as soon as the Second World War, as his two other brothers did. In fact, the middle brother, Kermit, joined the British Army first in the Middle East. And Uncle Ted started a rather spectacular career in the Army. Let's focus on him. So he fought in North Africa and over to Italy and up. Uh, you were right. Bradley made that statement. Bradley, however, was not a great fan of his at some point. Something happened. The whole story is very intricate. And so Uncle Ted was extremely popular with his troops. He was a frontline general. I mean, he was right there. But he sometimes alienated some of the other generals because he said what he wanted. He said what he thought was right. And so Patton and Bradley and others were often, or occasionally, he stepped on their toes, and that caused certain kinds of problems. But to get to the story you're talking about, after, various Italy and all that, he joined Eisenhower's group in preparing for D-Day. And as D-Day got closer, he said, it occurred to him, he said, we can't send the boys on the beach without a general officer. So he went to Bradley and proposed this, and Bradley thought it was a good idea. So he took it various ways. He took it to Eisenhower. Eisenhower agreed. So a call went out for volunteers, and Uncle Ted was the only one that volunteered. Now, the problem with Uncle Ted was that he was in very poor health. He already, I think, had a heart attack. He was on a cane. He was not in great shape. But he volunteered, and since he was the only one, he got the job. And so when the day came, by the way, this was the only father and son team in D-Day. His son landed in Omaha, and he and Uncle Ted landed in Utah. Utah was the only general officer, by the way, who landed that day. And he landed on, he was not a lead from rear type. So on Utah, he landed, and he was the first U.S. soldier on the beach. He was in the front of the first LST or whatever they were, dumped him there. And quickly they discovered that they had landed up several thousand yards off. And somebody, various people asked, well, what do we do here, sir? He had 35,000 soldiers coming in behind him on the same day. And his comment was something to the effect, well, gentlemen, the war begins here. So this is what we're going to do. And that was picked up by the press and reported all over the country, the D-Day. So you can see it in the articles. Anyway, he stood there. He was not one to cower behind anything. So he stood on the beach the whole day without ducking or anything. And, all hell was breaking loose. Anyway, he survived. And it was that to which Bradley referred to it. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for that, becoming the only father and son team to win the Medal of Honor. Not at the time, because his TR did not have the Medal of Honor at that time, but was awarded it later. And that's a whole nother story. But in any case, when he died very shortly thereafter of a heart attack, his death is considered a military death. And interestingly, both Bradley and Patton were pallbearers, even though they'd had rough times with him. I think then or at some other time, I think it was some other time that Bradley made the statement. We, of course, are very proud of that. But his brothers served my grandfather, Archie.
Yeah, let's talk about him.
Let's talk about him a little bit. So with the war. So Archie, he was in Big Red 1. When World War II came around, he'd been a businessman in the interim. He wanted a frontline assignment, but he was old by military, so he was in his 40s, I think, early 40s. And the Army didn't want to give him a frontline commission, but it helps to have a cousin in the White House. So he went over to FDR and begged FDR to do something about this. And FDR thought he was nuts, I guess. But he said, all right, I'll do it. So he told the Army to do it. Well, the Army doesn't like to be, told things like that. And so I've always theorized that to get back at him, they sent him to New Guinea. Now, if you talk to Second World Warers, just last night I was talking to some fellow, who was in the Second World War as an Army guy who served in Europe or something. Anyway, he when I mentioned, no, I guess he didn't serve in the Second World War, but anyway, whatever. He was a military guy. He when I told him New Guinea, he said, New Guinea? And that's the response I get when people who know New Guinea was terrible. It's terrible. Your grandfather wouldn't talk much about it, but he sometimes told me stories. They're absolutely spine tingling. And grandfather, as I think most of the infantry, he was an infantryman, always loved the infantry. Infantrymen, despised the Japanese because of their much more than the Germans, because of the needless loss of life by not giving up and all that. Anyway, so he served in New Guinea and he was injured in the same arm and the same leg and was, as a result, 100% disabled out of the war, barely survived again, and became the only US soldier to be 100% disabled from two wars, which says something about maybe his intelligence. I don't know. Anyway, we had a great relationship up till the teenage years when we kind of clashed over teenage stuff. He was great with kids. But to me, of course, I'm never flattered when people ask if I knew TR since he died in 1920. But in any case, 19, I guess, 1919. But, I realized I learned about TRs through my grandfather, not because he told me things, which I don't ever remember, but grandfathers' behavior with their grandchildren is often mirrored in what their parents' behavior to them was. And so he did all these things with me that he'd learned, you do with kids from his father. And I didn't realize this till much later, but, taking me on camping trips and, all the stuff and telling ghost stories and everything. It was just a direct reflection of TR. So in some ways, I feel I kind of knew him. It was interesting. Anyway, that's grandfather.
That is
Oh,
interesting to
I
hear
tell
that.
some other stories about grandfather. So when I got to be a teenager and the war in Vietnam and I was an anti-war type and so and I was a brash and as I look back rather embarrassingly thought I knew everything, like people do, college sophomores and so on. Uh, and so one of the interesting things was I went to Harvard and when I arrived at Harvard, I hadn't been there but a couple of days when I got into a minor traffic accident. I had this rattle trap car and I was driving around where the upperclassmen live. And the roads, I was a New York driver, so I didn't know anything about Massachusetts, unwritten rules. Well, one of the unwritten rules in Massachusetts I didn't know about was that the guy on the right always had the right of way, even if it were a very small little, almost a driveway. And whereas in New York, a major road had the right of way, and anyway. So here I was, and this small, it was where the urban setting. But I was driving along. I wasn't going particularly fast, maybe 20 miles an hour if, but I came to an intersection and this motorcycle came the other way on my right and I clipped it. So it went up in the air and he's fine. I mean, car's fine, everything's fine, but people are saying bone break, bone break. And I thought, oh my God, broken his leg and this and that. The police came and
Oh,
well, what happened was his name was Bone Break
no.
and he was a college football star.
Oh, no.
I had sent him to the hospital,
You took him out.
took him out. So he was fine. Came on that later. But the next day, the newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, published this story on the front page. Roosevelt injures famous, great hope for the football team. So that was embarrassing. But what was even more embarrassing, or in conjunction, there was another article on the front page, which they, of course, did on purpose. Uh, Grandfather had written a book and been very public about how he thought the Harvard economics department was full of commies. And so this book was published on this, around this time. And so here was this article about my grandfather on one side of me, anti-communist accusing Harvard all sorts of terrible things, and me. So that was my welcome to Harvard.
That's that's great. Now, what about Kermit? You mentioned him a little before. He was another soldier, First World War, and then what happened?
Kermit was a very tragic guy. There's a lot of alcoholism in the family. And back then they had no clue, like most families, I might add, there were plenty of alcoholics. Those people had, back there, they had no idea how to deal with alcoholics. And so they dealt with it mostly, and particularly, these are well-off people, with morality, why don't you just pull up your socks, babe? That sort of stuff. Well, we now know that's not the way it goes. It's not the way it works. So TR's brother was an alcoholic who died of alcoholism, basically, and who was, by the way, the father of Eleanor. And that's a tragic story in itself. Eleanor's upbringing was extraordinarily tragic. How she survived to be what, I mean, how anyone could be what she was, but when you know what her early life was like, it's much harder. Anyway, and his son Kermit was an alcoholic. And TR saw this him, and there's a whole long stories and everything, but in the Second World War, it eventually got to him. And he served with distinction, but his alcoholism overwhelmed him finally committed suicide. And you can imagine having such a guy as TR as your father, and so that was a very sad thing. Kermit was that family, they call themselves Kermit Kim, depending on which generation you are, and they're still around. My grandchild, the latest Kermit is, I don't know, 4 generations down or something. And he was a famous CIA guy who was reputed to put the Shah on the throne in the Peacock throne in Iran. And so that's well known. Less well known is another grandson, I guess, was at the CIA, at the agency, was had the role of Q. Remember Q from James Bond, who was the technical guy who gave James Bond all those toys?
Gadgets.
That's gadgets. That's what Unc, he was known in the family, CVS Cornelius Van Sack Roosevelt, did at the CIA. Unlike many Roosevelt, he didn't go to Harvard, he went to MIT and, became the leading tech guy. So anyway,
And he was the son of Kermit.
I guess he was the son of Kermit. I think I've got that right. He was one of Kermit's son. I get tangled up with all these, and it's much harder because Roosevelt's married Roosevelts.
Oh, gee, yeah.
Really, I mean, Eleanor was a Roosevelt before she married FDR. And by the way, it was Kermit, her father, the alcoholic we talked about a minute ago, who arranged for FDR, so to speak, match made, let's put a better word, for FDR's parents to marry.
Was that Elliot or Kermit? You said
Elliot, let's see, let me get confused. Yeah, we're talking about Elliot here.
Yep.
Elliot. And he he arranged that wedding, so to speak. I mean, he identified, they were very unlikely. They were quite different in age, 20 years or something, and very unlikely, but he did it. And then they got married and they produced FDR, who became his godson. And then his daughter married FDR. I mean, sort of, it's very confusing. As you can see, I get confused over Elliot's, and I should have a tree in front of me so I can remember what is what.
Yeah, it's like a genealogist's nightmare, I guess, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And genealogy is a whole nother story. But yeah, our family, I mean, some of the interrelationships were so confused.
Now, Quentin, you mentioned he was the youngest. He was kind of, from what I understand, he's kind of the apple of
Oh, yeah.
TRI.
Well, that tends to happen once you lose a child too, of course. But I think there's some truth to it in this occasion. He was a star. I mean, he was very young. He was only in early 20s, but he was very likable. And, who knows what would have happened if he'd survived.
Yeah, I noticed that I was looking up some things about Quentin online, and I was horrified actually to see a photograph that the Germans had taken
Oh,
after
yeah.
he'd been shot down. It's very graphic. And did I hear that the Germans sent a postcard to TR?
Yeah. Isn't that grim? What happened was he was shot down by the Germans, of course, on, I believe it was German territory, German held territory. It wasn't Germany, but it was German held territory. And when they discovered the plane crack in the body, they recognized who he was, and so they gave him a full military, big deal burial. But the Kaiser then had this postcard made, or somebody had this postcard made and sent to TR and to others. I mean, it's you can see it online, well, like you did. It's pretty gruesome and not one of the better moments of the war, but anyway.
I know there was documentary I was watching recently where I think TR was notified of his son being killed, which was, it must have been a terrible mix of emotions because I know TR was very proud of his boys being in the service and he wouldn't have it any other way. And yet now he's dealing with the death of one. Would he have wrestled with being feeling
Yeah, that's
responsible or anything like that?
I mean, his first concern, as would be anybody's, was how am I going to tell my wife? And then second, this underlying guilt. I somebody said, was it Edith, maybe? If you raise boys to be eagles, you can't expect them to be doves or something like that. And I don't think he ever recovered. There are people who say that this contributed to his eventual death, to some extent. I'm sure.
Yeah, he was only 60 years old. Now let's talk about Ethel.
Yeah, Ethel. Nobody's ever heard of Ethel. Uh, Ethel was the favorite in the family. Everybody loved Ethel. Ethel was terrific. I remember, of course, very well. She died when I was, I don't know, in my 30s, maybe. And people would think that Alice was the hero. No way. Ethel was the fam. Alice was, was Alice. Uh, Ethel was a very interesting lady. All the Roosevelts, they're smart, they're well educated, this and that, although not so well educated then as they are now. But nursing was her thing. She was the first of the Roosevelts, I believe, or at least of the family, to go to Europe in the First World War as a nurse. She was dyed in the wool Red Cross follower. In fact, her portrait she had painted, sort of kind of her official portrait of her in her Red Cross uniform. She married a doctor who was also went over to France very early, started, working with wounded soldiers, and that's what she did. And the rest of the time that she lived in Oyster Bay, she was a prominent. She was very prominent in crafting the legacy of TR and doing it with the Sagamore Hill and the creation of Sagamore Hill and other legacy issues, which her whole life, she supported and pushed and played a big role in. When TR died, the house, of course, became his widow's, and she lived it until she died. So when Edith died, the family was faced with the issue of what do you do with Sagamore Hill? And nobody wanted to live in it. I mean, it was this drafty, old, creaky, expensive, not modern house. Uncle Ted had built on the property a modern, I don't know, Georgian house or whatever the style is, which was, a modern house. So nobody wanted it. And they thought about, well, we got to do something, it's a national treasure in a sense. And so there was a big debate whether they should give it to the town or to the county or the state or the feds. And finally, they decided to give it to the Park Service. Turned out to be the right decision. And settled an endowment on it and gave it to the country. And it's been run by the Park Service ever since. So they've done a terrific job. It's easily visitable by anybody, although it's a little out of the way, but it's worth a trip. And it's really well preserved. And the house is filled primarily, almost all with real stuff. I mean, the family gave the whole thing, kit and caboodle. And so the furniture's all real, virtually all, and we'll place rugs and things, but that's what it is. It's exactly as I remember it. And my little room is exactly as I remember it.
Do you ever go there and look out that window again and find that little outhouse?
Yeah, I, of course, do take a lot of people on tours there. Yeah, absolutely.
That is so much fun. I did want to ask you about Ethel. You said you did know her. What was she
Oh,
like
yeah,
as a person?
she was great. She was a person you immediately liked. She was always and she focused on you even as a, pain in the ass 22-year-old kid who thought he knew everything. That's really good. I used to stay there with her occasionally. I remember I was in graduate school, so that was in the 70s. And I'd go out there and study. You study pretty hard in graduate school. And she would let me do that and feed me and house me for the weekends, and whatever. Everybody loved her. and she was uh, in that whole Oyster Bay community. She was a major player, and she was very much the little old lady that everybody loves. She kind
No.
of looked like that too. I mean, she was just the personification of sweet old lady.
Now,
So
when
that,
you said you stayed with her, was that still at Sagamore or was she
oh no, she had a house in Oyster Bay up on the other side of town that was a very nice open house on a fairly large piece of land. I don't know how big it was, I don't know how much land she had, but it was very bucolic. I mean, it was a wonderful place to spend the weekend.
Oh, what a nice memory.
Yeah, I remember sort of sitting that she had these window seats, big windows looking out over the garden and everything, sitting there in the sun in the morning, reading books on finance and statistics. So I did manage to get through them.
Oh, yeah, I know. I've been there. Now,
Yeah,
you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt before. Did you ever meet her?
sure. I, you know, she at that stage, first of all, I was a distant cousin. Well, not that distant because she was, in fact, I got this right. She's my first cousin, maybe three times removed or whatever it is. But I only met her a few times. But I went to a prep school called Millbrook, which is in upstate New York, near Poughkeepsie, and which is, of course, not far from Hyde Park. And one of her grandchildren, a guy named Haven Roosevelt, was a couple of classes ahead of me there. So she would come and visit him now and then, and I would be trotted out. But you know anything about prep schools, you know that prep school kids don't pay much attention to kids younger than them. So you're basically of no account. And so I met her occasionally.
Yeah. So Tweed, now we've talked about all the children, which is thank you for all that. That you gave us like nice little biographies on these incredible people. I have to think back at TR Jr. standing on Utah Beach that day. I wonder how much a picture of his father's face appeared in his mind during that time on Utah Beach. I really wonder.
I wonder, he didn't have much time,
No.
but thinking about it, I don't remember a photograph of him on the beach. There may well be one, but I don't know. I have to ask my cousin. His grandson, my generation, lives in Brooklyn Heights. We're good friends, of course, and he has his medals. Uncle Ted got he was like Audie Murphy. He got all the medals you could get. But there's a famous picture of him a day before or so before he died, sitting on the front bumper of a Jeep, holding a stick and everything. But I don't remember seeing a picture of him on the beach. Now that I think of it, you would have thought there would be, and maybe there is.
Yeah. Now, what about your dad? Your dad was also in the military, was he?
Yes, Dad, at the beginning of the first, well, let's see, where do we go here? He graduated from Harvard just before the war. He wanted to be a reporter, and he went out to the West Coast with his wife, Catherine, my mother, and I was conceived and born on the West Coast. I was born, I'd like to say I was born in San Francisco. Actually, it was the Berkeley Hospital where I was born. And I was born in 1942, in February of 1942. So the war had just started. And Dad took us back to the east to New York. And so I went back when I was 3 months old. I, of course, don't remember any of this. Uh, Sort of funny story about it. But anyway, and he went off to war. Now, Dad, believe it or not, spoke almost perfect Arabic, which he had learned in college. Harvard, believe it or not, taught Arabic. You look now, Harvard teaches something like 100 languages. I mean, some enormous number of languages. And he had a natural ability. He was really good at languages. When he uh, when he died, he spoke 17 languages.
Wow.
Anyway, so he joined the army and he was one of the army had Ricky's boys. You heard of them? That's
Oh,
been around for a while. So this is where they train intelligence officers. And of course, he went to intelligence because he spoke Arabic. And so he landed in Africa as an aide, a lieutenant aide, who's Arabic speaking guy. He spent a lot of time with the various generals when, when they needed such things. And there weren't very many people that spoke Arabic in the US Army. And so he was in intelligence throughout the war, wound up in Tehran when the war ended. And eventually my mother and I went out and met him in Tehran. And he was military intelligence, and he switched over to the Central Intelligence Agency and was with them, with the agency, for a 30-year, whatever it was, career, serving first in the Middle East, in Tehran, Beirut, and Istanbul, then in Europe, in Madrid and London, and then took over the Middle Eastern African division for a long time. So that's what he did till he retired.
So now let's talk about you. What has it been like? How's your life been affected, other than that, where you told us about the infamous bone break incident, grandfather writing the letter? What was it like for you growing up as a Roosevelt?
Well, as I said earlier, I paid no attention until I basically to college because of the fact that, nobody made much notice of that. So in college, perhaps I like to tell this story because it's interesting. When this really came to me, and perhaps the most important lesson I learned while I was in college was from the people called the Green Ladies. So the way it works there is there's a freshman dorms you go, and then you pick a house. They call them houses, and a house is supposed to be your sort of social center. And there were a manageable number of people in the house, so you could get to know them and your tutors and all this. It's a pretty good system, I thought. Anyway, my house was a house called Adams House, which was one of the more avant-garde ones. But in any case, as far as it relates to this story, you ate at your house. So your house had a dining room. And in Adam's case, they also had a kitchen. They cooked all the food. And you were served in the dining room. They had these sort of small cartwheel size plates divided up into sections, plastic. And that's what you went through the line, and the line of serving ladies would serve you, whatever it was. And they wore green, uniforms. And so we called them, of course, the Green Ladies, wombats for a reason I never understood. But anyway, and the head Green Lady was Mrs. O'Brien. All the Green Ladies were these, to us, ancient Irish ladies from Southie in Boston. We thought they were ancient. They were probably, in their 40s or something. But
Yeah.
and they'd seen it all, class after class. You couldn't do much to do. Well, in those days, two things. One is you had to wear a coat and tie, and they called you Mister. Everybody in college then called you Mister, including the professors. So I was Mr. Roosevelt. And the head Green Lady, Mrs. O'Brien, we were terrified of her. I mean, think of the most scary Irish nun, and you got an idea of what she was like. And she controlled all the Green Ladies. She had a little tiny office off to the side of, in the dining room. When kids got into trouble, all she had to do was lift her finger, and people.
She was on it.
We being sophomores, we tried to do things, to shock people. So, yeah, we were not so good. Of course, our clothing wasn't great. I mean, we had a tweed jacket, some tie. So I remember once one kid decided to stretch. We pushed the envelope as far as we could. Well, this guy went further than most. So he shows up at breakfast with a coat and tie and no shirt.
Was that you?
No, it wasn't me. It was somebody else. And so we all knew this was going to happen. We'd been part of the planning of there, at least knew about it. So we watch him. So he gets about halfway down the line of the serving the Green Ladies when Mrs. O'Brien's door opens.
Oh.
And out she comes. How she knew, we don't know. But she comes out and she pointed at him and said, Mr. Jones, who are the, come here. So Mr. Jones now, not quite so sure that he's doing something, is a good idea what he's doing, goes into the office and the door slams shut. You can hear coming out of the office, and then the door opens and out slinks this guy, sort of looking over his shoulder, and that gets halfway down and runs out of the dining hall. So we're all quite taken aback. We didn't see him again for a while. He showed up anyway. So there's that. It gives you an idea. So one morning I show up, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm looking pretty normal. I mean, yeah, my jacket's a little ratty. I'm sure I've got that stained tie and so on, but there's nothing unusual about it. And one of the green ladies says to me, Mrs. O'Brien would like to see you, Mr. Roosevelt. Oh my God, what have I done? I'm thinking, what have I done? I don't think I've done anything. So I go over and knock on her door. Come in. So I go in. First time I've been in her office. Well, her office was basically a broom closet. It had a desk, her chair, and maybe a file cabinet, a table or something. No chair for me. So you go and standing there, look at her. And she looked at me in sort of a silence, and I'm sweating blood. And she said, Mr. Roosevelt, she says, and I knew exactly what she meant. She said, it's all right for those other boys to look like that, but it's not all right for you to look like that. And that hit me, like a ton of bricks. And my immediate reaction was, how dare you? But of course, I didn't say any of that.
No, she'd twist you into a pretzel.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you had no chance against Mrs. O'Brien. So, but what a lesson, and that's when I realized I get a lot of benefits, but they come with obligations.
Yeah.
And the obligations are not, there are a lot of kind of negative or at least irritating or, annoying aspects of being recognized and being, all this stuff. But I realized that, as I say, I get lots of benefits. So I had to pay the price. And in a way, it was almost like, it's like a public duty because I represent, and people like me represent Americana to a lot of people, particularly people who don't often meet anybody who's a famous family. And it's part of being an American, and it's part of, responsibility. It's an obligation and a responsibility. And so I try to remind myself because, it's first of all, what 21-year-old wants to be known for his great grandfather? You don't, you're trying to make your own way in life. And so it can be irritating and belittling or upsetting. I'm not my great grandfather. Why don't you pay attention to me? I think I'm blah blah blah. So it taught me that I had to put up with it. But it in its own way is important. It's part of people who meet me and other things like that. It's part of reinforcing being an American. So anyway.
Well, this is wonderful. And what you're doing now, you're carrying on by being the chairman of the Roosevelt School at LIU and the work you're doing with the presidential descendants and being on with me on our podcast, talking about your wonderful memories. And I'm sure you've done some academic work on your family as well.
You can see some of my talks at the LIU website, Roosevelt School website. I highly recommend, given all the stuff we're talking about, as relatives, watch the Saints and Sinners video, I guess it is.
I actually listened to that this morning. And if we could just part with one last thing. I was just going to pick somebody out. If you can sort of recall what you said about this person, because it was fantastic. You talked about TR's uncle, Robert Barnhill Roosevelt. Could you tell us just a little about that relative of his?
Well, the problem is it's about a 20-minute talk, and that talk.
Reader's Digest possible?
Yeah. He was quite a character. Interesting. He was, well, Cornelius Van Sack Roosevelt was TR's senior. TR's father was TR. And so TR's senior father and his brother, TR's uncle, was this guy, Robert Barnhill Roosevelt. Anyway, RBR played a big role in TR. Now, one of the things about RBR was that he was a very early, not only conservationist, but person who understood the importance of the whole environment for conservation, and that you had to look at the whole picture. And he was particularly interested in fish. freshwater fish. And he was very instrumental in doing various things to save the rivers of New York and other places and so on. He actually got elected to Congress for one term just to pass certain laws that protected rivers and streams in the United States. Anyway, and he was a big influence on TR. TR, a lot of people say that TR developed his conservation image or, imagination or view about the world from his trip out west, but actually it started with Uncle RBR, Uncle Rob. And but one of the more interesting and somewhat scandalous aspects of RBR is RBR married a woman who kind of lost interest in him. And women sometimes did this in those days. She basically retired to her bedroom and never emerged. And RBR was a rather lusty guy. He'd been known in his bachelorhood of, escorting showgirls around town and so on. So eventually he acquired a girlfriend, lover, and he installed her about a block or two away from his house.
Oh no.
Proceeded to father 3 children with her and paid attention to them. Well, his wife eventually died and he married this woman. So, it was obviously it was a love match and adopted the children, even though they were already his, but nobody knew that. And it wasn't until much later that this sort of came out. But one of the children joined the army and became, while TR was president, one of his military aides in the White House. And TR obviously knew the relationship, but I suspect he didn't have any idea that RBR was this young officer's father. And the 3 children had a rather mottled career. So that's another whole long story. RBR, he survived the scandal while he lived, but eventually, as I say, it came out, and so that people had to figure out how to deal with that. But they did, of course.
So all the skeletons came charging out of the closet after he was dead.
There's skeletons in the closet. Some of them weren't very far in the closet. TR's brother fathered an illegitimate child with a maid, and that did not go well. So sometimes these things don't go very well.
Wow.
But family like anybody else. I mean, the difference is that most people don't know who their third cousins twice removed are. But if you're in a family like ours, which 2 things, one prominent and 2 unique in the sense the name is only for this family, you can you can discover a lot of closets that might not in other families.
Well, I've just asked you to give a teaser, which we're going to leave it at that because I want people to go to they're on YouTube. The one I watched was on YouTube. It was from LIU.
Yeah, you can find them on YouTube. If you just Google or YouTube or whatever the word is, my name, you'll see a whole bunch of my speeches. And I recommend the ones that are called Tales of TR, which can also be seen on the Roosevelt School website, some of them.
And you've done such a good job telling these stories. And Tweed, I'm so thankful that you were able to take time to speak with your history, your story. And what are you up to now? What's going on right now?
Well, let's see. What can I tell you? Well, I'm heavily involved in the Roosevelt School.
And I know you've been doing some work with the presidential descendants. I know you were down in Florida recently. I saw a piece on the news. Actually, you were down with some other people that we've interviewed as well. And did you have a good time down there?
Yeah, we were down. The Truman Little White House is in Key West, and that's where we were. And on President's Day, they sometimes bring together various people, and we were there for this and that. And that was great fun. Yeah, that's a lovely. Key West is great. I love standing. I live in Boston as well as the Vineyard. Boston, Route 1 runs through Boston, and the Route 1 starts at Key West. There's a little sign there, and it goes. Route 1 goes all the way to Maine and northern Maine to the Canadian border.
Wow.
So I'm sitting at one end holding the reins, I felt. But anyway, that's a great event, and there are many of that. Just a quick word about the society. Aside from creating a platform for descendants to meet, we have two other sort of important purposes. One is we support presidential studies in various ways. And one of the things we do is every other year, we have a book award for the best book on presidency, leadership, basically, not biographies. And we give a substantial prize, $10,000 to the winner, to try to encourage people to write about this. And our second one will be held in New York this year at the University Club in October, where we will do it. And I'm sort of beginning to go through the process of choosing the books. I got a list of about 100 books. I winnowed it down to 30 something, and I'll get it. Various presidential descendants, pitched in to help, and we got it down to about 15. When we get it to 9, we'll give it to some independent judges, and then we'll pick it. So that's an important thing. And the other thing we do is civics, abysmal civic states. We and a great many other people trying to do something about that. So those are some of the good things we do.
Well, terrific. Keep up the good work. Tweed, thank you again. And I really appreciate you meeting with us. You've been a wonderful guest.
Well, thank you, James. I've had a lot of fun. So it's great. Good luck. And I look forward to seeing whatever your next choice of sort of your history, your story.
Well, we've got plenty of guests lined up and we're excited about all of them. But again, I want to thank you and I hope you have a great day, Tweed.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Till next time, be well and God bless.